All right, joining us here today for our professional skills for the research scientist class, we have Dr. Colleen Munoz from the University of Hartford, and she is there within the Department of Health Sciences. So welcome, Colleen.
Hi.
And
Thanks for having
Colleen,
me.
yeah, Colleen is one of my colleagues back from when I was in grad school. We were in grad school together, working with different advisors, but in the same research lab, most days. And we commiserated over a lot of data collection together. But the reason I'm bringing Colleen in today is because, first of all, I think she's a really great presenter. And second, since we have similar research fields, we've watched a lot of the same presentations at conferences over the years. So we've seen good things and bad things kind of side by side and looked over one another and been like, or that was really good. So, Colleen, thanks for coming to give us your opinion today. So my first question for you is, what are the things that you do specifically when you are prepping to give a talk, a scientific talk about data?
Yeah, so this is one of those things that it probably took me an embarrassingly long amount of time to develop. But the simple stuff like an outline, I didn't do for the longest time. I think that I finally started figuring that out probably later in my PhD, that was very helpful. And I kind of look at it as a paper in that sense, and I teach my students that as well. So I think by developing an outline, where am I really going with this? What are the key things that I want to say? And that can really set me up for A, not wasting my time, but B, having a really clearly laid out presentation where the person's not guessing, what's the relevance, what's the, how was it done, and then what's the take-home message kind of idea. So I think that's a good practice.
So that's pretty much where you start. You start with the outline, and then you go from there. You say, okay, where do I want to start? One thing I generally do is I'm like, people aren't going to remember too much from a presentation. And I start with, if this person had to leave the room and remember like 3 things, what are those 3 things going to be? And I kind of say, okay, if that's what I want them to leave with, what do I start with? And kind of go down that road.
Yeah, exactly. And I think along those same lines, with those key pieces of information that normally wind up in my outline, I will, I'll make them so bold sometimes. Like I've numerous times had just a white background with that one sentence and nothing else on it, so don't make it too fancy.
That's it. That's really important. You can overcomplicate slides very, very easily. And the thing I say is that the slides next to you should complement what you're saying. We want the attention to be on you. You're the expert, the person up there talking. And I've definitely seen it too many times where the slides become the focus of the presentation. That's not our goal.
Yeah, exactly.
So, okay, so that's where you start. You start with the outline, and then from there, let's say, what about slide design? We already talked about it being simple. Do you have any kind of like rules of thumbs that you like to kind of abide by?
Now that's funny, because I think there's a lot of personal preference out there. Like I know my master's advisor, Dr. Dan Jellison, who I would consider a fantastic presenter. I think he's got, he's probably done some of the best presentations I've seen, but he always had this strong opinion that the slide should always be a dark background and that the lettering should always be light in color. And then I got to UConn and I found that people had completely different opinions, that it should be a white background with dark lettering. So, is there an optimal way to go about that? I don't know. But I will say that the light background does make your life a lot easier when you're trying to insert pictures and things like that. If that's the reason why I adopted that, I don't know. But I tend to use a light colored background, normally white, and then I'll use some colors to either highlight certain information or as part of my organization for my information as well, so that people can visually see my organization, not just hear it. So if there's any question about, okay, we're talking about this variable is always in this color. Or if it's this general principle, like I know some of the work we did with oxidative stress, if it was an antioxidant enzyme, those were always represented in this color. And I'd always try to, even add some diagrams to help people follow along with that color coding as well.
That brings up another good point. I think that's something really cool to keep in mind with the colors and, keeping that consistent throughout. That's definitely really important. Nothing's more frustrating than seeing a font change or a color change halfway through a presentation. You're like, what's going on here? But that brings up another interesting point about the kind of the balance that you usually put between text and figures. Where do you kind of lean on that?
Definitely less text, more figures. I mean, even with my intros, where you wouldn't even see any figures or any data yet, definitely lighter on the text side. Getting back to what you pointed out before, that people aren't going to remember that, and you want them to be paying attention to you and what you're saying. If you have a whole lot going on the screen, they're only going to read what's on the screen, and they're going to kind of tune you out a little bit.
Yeah.
So I really think about what's important. I won't put, and maybe this is negative in some people's eyes, but I normally don't even put references in my intro. I will say them out loud. I'll say so-and-so et al, presented some work, and I give them the recognition, but I prefer to limit the words on the slides.
Okay, so that brings me to the next point. So we've talked about, kind of where you start, making the slides themselves. Let's go to kind of like right before the presentation and prepping yourself to give that talk. Now, one thing I definitely would say about your presentation style is it is smooth. Like, I feel like, we are just on, from the moment you start talking about most of your presentations, I feel like we're kind of on a nice kind of gentle ride down a river as we're going through your presentation. So what do you do to kind of get that flow going?
Yeah, that's evolved over the years as well. So I'll never forget my first oral presentation, ACSM. I think we were in Baltimore. I remember Dan Judelson said, I'm going to tell you right now, you're not going to be able to eat lunch before this, because it was at like 2 p.m. or something like that. And I was like, yeah, I'll be able to eat whatever. And he was absolutely right. I almost threw up. And I freaked out. But the thing that got me through that was I rehearsed the hell out of it. So much so that honestly, I probably had 95% of that thing memorized. So I think for a 10-minute presentation, could you memorize it? Yes. And I think I did that for a number of years to help me be less nervous. I think that's a huge part of giving a smooth presentation is if you know exactly what you want to say. You start freaking out if you're like, oh my gosh, what am I going to say about that slide? So I would recommend that students who don't have a lot of experience consider memorizing at least parts of it, the parts that you're more uncomfortable with. And I find myself backing off on the memorization a little bit as I progress through my career, but I still, to this day, if there's a slide that that stresses me out, I'll memorize exactly what I want to say.
Yeah, if you're talking about a complicated mechanism, you need to be able to say that in a clear way. And there's ways to say it that are clear and ways to say it that are not. And I agree with you. Like early in your career, when you're wide-eyed and you're talking, about a topic that's bigger than you are, I think more memorization early in your career is important. And then as you get more and more comfortable with the topics, I think, moving away from that memorization can be important, because now you're not trying to prove that you know about the topic. Now you're trying to be a little bit, add some of those entertaining kind of aspects to your presentation, which are important. The thing is, like, if you had to balance the two, which is more important, being correct and saying what you want to say and being entertaining? Well, being correct is way more important. So
Absolutely.
Early in your career, focus on that. Once you got that down, then start adding in some of the levity and some of the kind of ad-libbing that can make some presentations, just a little bit more entertaining. Cool. Okay, so that's all those things.
But
go ahead.
Let me just say one more thing really fast about the memorization, because I've had some students that get tripped up on that. That's sort of a go big or go home situation. I mean, you actually have to memorize it, because I've definitely noticed at times when people say, yeah, I memorized it, I'll be okay. They really didn't. And then all of a sudden they freak out if they forgot a word or if they can't remember the next sentence, so that's definitely something you got to commit to.
That's a really good thing. I have a story about that from my postdoc. There was a super fantastic doctoral student there when I was there, and they were practicing for an upcoming presentation at a regional ACSM. And so we practiced in our lab group, and they got up there and they stood there, and the first slide came up, and they just stood there for like 10 seconds, 15 seconds, and then just started crying and left the room. And so obviously exactly what you said happened. But let me tell you this, that same person gave that presentation at the regional conference and won the doctoral student award. So that's what it is. It was just, they missed that one little thing and they didn't have it. And then as soon as they got that full memorization, they were like on a rail and they gave a fantastic presentation. So just a good story about that. And I think it kind of personifies what you're saying. If you're going to memorize it, make sure you memorize it. Okay, so now let's talk about like during the presentation, what are you thinking? Or are you not?
Okay, that's a good question. I mean, I think a lot of what I'm trying to do now that I'm comfortable with what I'm trying to say, right, is to make it enjoyable to listen to. So I try to alter the dynamics of my voice, especially when I want to emphasize certain things. I will occasionally use my hands, but you always got to be careful not to punch the microphone. I've seen that, I don't know, dozens of times.
Bunch of times, yeah.
Yeah. And, obviously using any other tools that you have at your disposal. So whether that's like a laser pointer, some people are better at that than others. And I don't think you have to use one. I know some people kind of feel obligated, and that doesn't go well either because they just look incredibly nervous. And I'm one of those people. So depends on the setting. If it's a large audience, I'm normally too nervous and I don't use it. So that's when I start to insert tools in my slides so that I can verbally point to them, so lots of explaining of figures, walk them through the whole XY axis, everything that they're looking at. Because if you start talking about the interpretation of those results when people are still trying to familiarize themselves with the figure itself, they're not listening to you anymore, And I think you and I have probably seen a million presentations like that where they didn't orient you and you're like, well, what am I looking at?
Exactly. They'll show the panel that's a cutout from the paper that has 9 different graphs in it. And they're only talking about one of those graphs, but they didn't take the time to either redraw it or zoom in on that one figure that they're actually talking about. They just show all 9. And you're completely lost. Which variable are we talking about here? I don't even know. And then they just move on as if you were following along. Yeah.
Right. And how many times have we heard people say that? We're like, oh, well, you probably can't see it. But so they just didn't think ahead. Is this going to be big enough on the screen?
Absolutely. That's really, really important. So rule of thumb for font size then.
Ooh, an exact number in my head, I don't know that I have. But I think if I remember correctly, I wouldn't go any less than like a 16-ish in that general range.
I've heard 16, 18. Yeah.
Yeah. But again, if you're trying to emphasize something, time to kick up the font size a notch.
Make it big. Okay, so towards the end of the presentation, you're kind of wrapping up. We're into the question and answer part. Any kind of tips or tricks for that part of the presentation? Because that can get a little bit hairy with some people.
Oh, yeah. And I think I've even caught myself in situations where you wish you would have handled that differently, But I think some of the things that help, don't feel obligated to answer so rapidly, nobody's going to question your knowledge if you stop and think for a second, sometimes I'll do that by saying like, wow, that's a great question. I think another thing, and this is true for other scenarios, like this always comes to mind with the doctoral comprehensive exams. It's okay if you don't know, but I wouldn't leave it at that. Right. So, and make sure that you tell everybody, I don't know, so a lot of times I'll use things like, that's a great question. I'm not sure, but if you'll allow me to speculate, this is what's going through my mind, so I kind of will say, I imagine that this would be the case, but, I'd have to check to see if that's true in the literature, or perhaps that's a new field of study,
Would you ever follow up with a person, like if you're in a smaller audience and a person asks questions that you don't know, would you go up to them afterwards and be like, hey, that was a good question?
I have done that before, actually. Yeah. Exchange email information. Yeah. That's probably only happened maybe once or twice, but yes. Yeah.
I think early in your career, that's like almost like a power move, especially if it's a established PI who might be asking the questions at the conference or something like that, to show the confidence to go up to them and say, hey, I'm sorry I didn't know the answer to your question, but let me look into it. I really want to get back to you. And that shows a lot of initiative from, a young career investigator. And also that person's going to be a little bit impressed that, you came up to them in the first place and were willing to follow up, because the biggest thing about being a scientist is you're going to make a lot of mistakes. And if you're not willing to stare those mistakes in the face and, figure out why they happened, then your career is going to be pretty short.
Yeah, probably. And, along those lines, I don't know if you'll remember this, Evan, but it's one of the funnier things that I've ever done in my career. I also recommend that you start to get to know what people look like in your immediate field of study. So whether that be introducing yourself to them at a conference, or at the very least looking up their picture online, because I don't know if you remember, Evan, but I got caught in that once.
You introduce a paper and they're like, yeah, that's my paper.
Yeah, something like that. It was Sam Chevrant got up, asked a question. He asked a question that was specific about one of his papers, but he didn't say that. And I was so nervous at the time. I think he introduced himself, but I didn't even hear him say his name. And I immediately said, well, Dr. Chevrant in his lab did this, and everybody laughed. And I didn't really know why they laughed until somebody said later, that was Sam Chevrant. I was just super embarrassed.
That's a good little tip. If you're relying, on a couple, papers heavily in your presentation, it's a good idea to look up those people if you're not familiar with the people in the field. That's a really cool tip that I haven't even thought about before.
Yeah.
But I'm sure I'd be, prone to make that mistake too, with a lot of things that I'm talking about now. Changing my area of study in some sense, doing some more renal stuff. Like I don't know a lot of the renal people, so that would be important to do.
Right.
So I'll take that tip too. All right, so let's finish it up here. Kind of some of your absolute do not do these things. What are some of the worst case scenario things, or kind of some of the conventions that you see that everybody does this thing and that is just something that is unnecessary and actually takes away from your presentation?
That's a good question. Well, sometimes I think people might get a little bogged down with some of the detail in maybe their statistical sections, or you just always got to think about your audience. If you're presenting some more mechanistic work at even an ACSM conference, where sure, there's mechanistic scientists there, but maybe they're not the majority, I'd probably tone that back a little bit, because you're going to lose everybody in the audience, so always think about the level of who you're talking to. Another big one, like we already identified, is people not making the take-home messages clear. I think I would also say sometimes I get a little confused when people don't use specific terms when they're describing things. So when they'll say and this means that, or when that happened, wait, remind me, what are you talking about again?
When what? Right.
Yeah, and I think that's another thing, is repetition can be okay, as long as it's in the right context and the right spot in the slide set, so even if you talked about something a couple minutes ago, it's okay to bring it back up, especially if it's relevant, to your current discussion. So if you want to say, if you recall, we found this at minute 2, blah, blah, blah. So don't assume that everybody remembers, because they don't.
They definitely don't. Yeah, that's a piece of advice I actually got from one of my buddy's fathers, who is in marketing. And I've taken this and applied this to scientific presentations as well. It's basically, the beginning of the presentation, tell them what you're about to tell them. And then in the middle of the presentation, you are telling them. And then at the end of the presentation, you tell the audience what you just told them. And that repetition makes them say when they leave, oh yeah, I just saw this presentation about this, because they heard it 3 times. And
it's sort of like storytelling.
That's another big part.
We're always so trained as students, when you write your lab reports and things like that, that it's supposed to be, so cut and dry and, kind of boring. And I get, we all have to learn that way to get some of the basic principles down, but you come to a point where make a story about it. It doesn't have to be so plain, so black and white. You can alter the order of things a little bit. I know, it's okay to put your discussion pieces with your results in this sense and things of that nature. So you can get a little creative with the presentation, where sometimes that becomes limited when you're writing up, in a formal sense.
Yeah, that sounds really good. I think that's something to take, seriously. It's like you're not in the manuscript format when you're giving a presentation. It's not intro, methods, results, discussion. No, you can blend those throughout. And then the other piece of advice I like to give there is the little section at the end of your paper where you're talking about practical applications, or what this relates to, and how people can understand it. Start with that, and then talk about how your results apply to that practical application. And that allows you to kind of make that story a little bit more. So, all right. Any last tips or tricks for people who are about to, because we have a lot of kind of first and second year master's students in here, a couple PhD students. So they're in the process of maybe proposing their master's thesis or getting ready to defend their master's thesis. Any quick little tips or tricks for those people in this kind of very nerve-wracking time?
Yeah, sure. I think, one last thing that comes to mind is Animations can be really powerful. They can be a really helpful tool, but I would limit them. So we've definitely seen those presentations where people have too many. And then you also have to, not only do you have to practice what you want to say, but you have to practice using it with your slides, right? Because it's really awkward if you forgot that you had an animation or something like that, or knowing how many animations you have, and then you accidentally go to the next slide or something. So I think they can be a really powerful tool. I wouldn't even recommend putting them on every slide. I would just think about, if you have maybe a diagram, or maybe there's a little bit more information on your slide than you would typically like, maybe that's okay. It's what you have to do for that piece of data. But you can separate it by the animation so that people can follow along with each part and they don't get overwhelmed and they see your story, right? So I think that can be helpful too, but limit them.
Yeah, I think that's a great place to start, and kind of good place to finish our conversation as well. So thank you very much for kind of giving us your input and your advice for how to give a good presentation.
Sure, absolutely. Thank you for having me.